I'm going to continue talking about ancient Mesopotamia. And of course, in my part one lecture, we had talked about the background of Mesopotamia. I had discussed also into some of the early civilizations. We had talked about most of the Sumerian culture, and I also got into, did briefly talk about the so-called Akkadians, the Akkadian Empire that was around for a short time. So I kind of, that's where we were from last time. And then, of course, from there, I'm going to kind of talk about, like I said, some of the other civilizations that come later in Mesopotamia. Now, of course, like I said, I was going to go ahead and first talk about the Babylonian civilization, which we'll mostly talk about actually it's called the Paleo, or also known as the Old Babylonian Empire. That was the one they were talking about in the video when they were talking about King Hammurabi in his empire. And this was an empire that developed in the southern part of Mesopotamia. It kind of dates back to about the 18th century BC, although they think it went back further than that, closer to like 1900 or 2000 BC, they think, because the city of Babylon itself goes back further, maybe like close to 1900 or so, or maybe before that, that it was around. It may have been some kind of Akkadian type city, they think, a long time ago. If we go to this slide here, I'll show you. The original name for Babylon was actually Babylon. That's actually what they call it, Babylon. And over time, Babylon is more of a name that comes about over time. Might have been the Greek name. They call it later, but Babylon was a city-state and city later that basically developed on the Euphrates River Valley. So right here, central Iraq, it's about where it is. Kind of looks like south of Baghdad a little bit. I think it how many miles it is south of Baghdad. Maybe I want to say 50 miles or so, something like that. And the Babylonians were actually controlled by different peoples. I'll kind of explain the different groups that are there, but they have the Akkadians make up the bulk of the Babylonian people. That we remember, because we talked about how the Akkadians kind of took over all of Iraq, and the northern part was Assyria, southern part was Babylonia. They're all kind of like related to each other. But they also had these other people that were called Amorites that they had. The Amorites were a type of Semitic people that they think originated actually in the upper part of the Euphrates is really where they're from. I think maybe where Syria is, they think. And they took over Babylonia and basically ruled as the kings. So most of the, I guess, Hammurabi dynasty, whatever you want to call it, was basically related to mostly Amorites. And both are Semitic. Both the Akkadians and the Amorites were a Semitic people of that region. Of course, they talk about the most famous king, of course, that ruled. There, of course, is King Hammurabi. You see on the right with his so-called, you can see there, you can see that's the Code of Hammurabi, the famous stele or stela, the stone pillar that it's, of course, on right there. Hammurabi was not the first king. He was the sixth king of the Babylonians. And Hammurabi is mostly instrumental in conquering a majority of their empire, because originally their state started out really small. In that area we're looking at in that map, it was a small area at first, not that one, but this one. You can see it started right here, and then from there it expanded into like where Sumer was down here, and up into the north, where it says Mari right there. And so, yeah, most of the Euphrates Basin and part of the Tigris Basin, you can see are the regions that they predominantly conquered. He's really the greatest king that they had, of that Babylonian period. And I'll get to it later, but they call this period sometimes Paleo or Old Babylonian Empire because so you don't confuse with the new or Neo one. So later, I'll get to it later. You have the the one of Nebuchadnezzar that you have later, which is like 1,000 years later. like Nebuchadnezzar lived like in about, I want to say 6th century BC. So it's a different time period. So that's sometimes why they'll use that name to describe his empire, more or less. Now, as you know, Hammurabi is very famous for his law code system, of course, which is the Code of Hammurabi, which you can see right here. Of course, it wasn't the first, law code system that developed, but it's considered, one of the first major law code systems that influenced a lot of other civilizations later. And it's basically a Babylonian legal code that they think that was developed in the early part of the 18th century. I want to say close to like the 1770s. I think maybe is when they think it was actually developed. And it was written on these stone columns, which you saw in the video. It's kind of a black granite type stone. I think they call it dorite. It was actually written on. It's not quite 8 feet tall. I think it's like 7 foot and about 4 inches tall. So 7 to 8 feet. That's how tall these stone structures were that they put the actual code on it. It was written in Akkadian cuneiform, like a type of dialect that was influenced by the Sumerians. There were probably a bunch of these that existed at one point where they would erect these like in courtyards or wherever else, so people would know what the laws were in general. But the primary one that's still around today is in the Louvre in Paris, France. It was discovered in 1901 in Persia or Iran, a place called Susa. Now, of course, I just showed you earlier, the actual, there it is right there. And you'll notice it's got this part at the top here, an image of what they think is, they think it's like Hammurabi sitting on his throne. And he's receiving the laws from, they think, the god Shamash, which I think I told you, Shamash is also called Utu by the Sumerians. And Shamash was a solar god of the sun, but he was also the god of justice in Mesopotamia. So that's him at the top, as you can see in there. And it's, by the way, pretty long and extensive. The actual code itself has got 3,600 lines of cuneiform in it, but the amount of laws is about 282 that they don't translate total. So 282 laws that's on the actual code itself. The code is famous for a principle that they usually call it either lex talionis, which means law of retaliation, or the other term they use too is an eye for an eye principle. The idea somebody does something to you, that you had a right to do something to them, kind of like a form of equal justice. But as you saw in the actual, little short video, it all depended on your social standing. So obviously people that are upper classes tend to maybe get off more on, say, if they committed a crime or whatever, or broke the law. So it might be a fine or something like that. But it seems like a lot of the laws, like if you commit something that's illegal or whatever, like a crime, it's either a fine, it's either death, or they cut something off, like your hand or an ear or your tongue. so things like that. I do have examples of some laws they have. I'll kind of put up here for you to look at. But yeah, those are some examples. So 195, if the son strikes his father, his hand shall be cut off. Wow. 197, if you break another man's bone, his bone shall be broken. If anyone strike the thigh of a man higher in rank than he shall receive 60 blows with an ox whip in public. So some of these are examples that are famous. The one on the bottom, 282. If a slave says to his master, "You are not my master," they convict him. The master shall cut off his ear. Of course, I put those on the bottom for you, but those are the ones that are the most famous in the code. 196 talks about an eye for an eye. And then 200 talks about tooth for a tooth. I think 200, the actual full one is, if a man knock out the teeth of his equal, his teeth shall be knocked out. So that all shows up in the Bible later, what we call Mosaic law, 10 Commandments and things like that. So they think a lot of these, codes may have influenced other law codes later. They do think the Persians, like the Persian Empire, was heavily influenced by of course, the law codes. So, and yeah, the law codes are interesting about like the Babylonian codes, like that they, of course, produced back then. You know, women under the code had, you know, various rights as well. I'll kind of give you some examples. Women had a right to divorce. They had a right to own slaves, transaction of business. They could bequeath property in a will. So actually under these laws, women had, you know, various rights that later they just don't have as much in ancient times. Also, the codes were mostly developed to create law and order, you know, justice and stability. Those are pretty much the reasons for why the codes were overall developed. So, but their empire didn't last. Like the Babylonian Empire only lasted roughly about 2 centuries, but the one of Hammurabi and his dynasty. And what happened to the Babylonians, they were conquered by other people. They do have like the Kassites that come in. I think that's the main group they talk about that comes in and conquers Babylon. The Kassites were a type of people in Iran, which they don't know too much about. They're kind of like a non-Semitic, non-Indo-Aryan peoples of that region, like in the Zagros Mountains region, which is in western Iran. They would come in and actually settle there and take over Mesopotamia for like 400 years. So they were in there for a short time. But they had another group that came in too, that's well known, which is the Hittites. The Hittites, if you know about this, in 1595, they sacked they sacked Babylon. They actually attacked it and sacked the city. And then so after that, the Kassites were able to come in and just take over. That's what they really think that happened at that point. So we're going to talk a few minutes on the Hittites a little bit, kind of get more into them, because Hittites are kind of a major power in the region of like Turkey, Syria mostly. They have kind of an influence on Iraq also as well. And a little about the Hittites and, of course, their background. The Hittites were not a Semitic people. If you know much about them, the Hittites were actually Indo-European in origin. I think the theory about the Hittites was that somewhere about almost 4,000 years ago, they settled in what is Turkey, sort of in that region, which in ancient times they called Turkey different names. One name was Anatolia. This one, of course, I think probably the Greek name that's more known. Other name later they call it is also, I'll get to it later, they call it a Hattusa. I'll talk about it later. Hattusa was the other name. They also called it in Turkey for a long time. They don't call it Turkey until like the Turks come in from like part of Central Asia and settle there. So they get that name later. But they think the Hittites weren't from that area of Anatolia or Turkey. They were from like what they think was the southern part of Ukraine, like above the Black Sea. They migrated in there and eventually took over that area. In that map you can see here, you can see they settled predominantly in this area in central Turkey right here. They also controlled part of Syria at one point. So where Aleppo is and Carchemish in Syria today. Those are areas that they originally settled. And they think a lot of these early cities that were there, I think, may have founded them originally a long time ago. And but they call it the Hittite Empire, but oftentimes the names that they often use was like the Empire of Hattusa or the Hattusa Kingdom. I think were common names that were often used for it. Or also the Hatti. That's another name, though, sometimes called the Hatti is another name. And I think the term Hittite is more of a name you see in the Bible. That's later. But you can see their capitals up there in that picture. It says Hattusis, right? Or either Hattusis or Hattusa, usually Hattusis. That's how they say it, really. And they have like a lot of famous kings that were well known. Like I've got some I'll kind of mention today, but King Hattusila, I think they always talk about him as being one of their first great kings, the one that founded the city, the capital. They're known for Hattusis. And King Mursila, I think, was a grandson that was later another ruler. He was the one that sacked Babylon at the beginning of the 16th century, close to like 595 BC. So this is really a period of the Hittites, which is more of a Bronze Age period, because they talk about the old Hittite like state kingdom or whatever they had a long time ago, and then later there's like a Neo-Hittite type state or empire, which is kind of like late Bronze Age and early Iron Age is when it comes in eventually. Now, one thing about the Hittites were known for being one of the first to kind of monopolize the development of iron. And apparently in Turkey, they discovered like meteorites, which were mostly made of iron. And so they started making like tools and weapons out of them. So there's been some theories that they may have monopolized iron a little bit, at least in that region. That's kind of a myth about that, I think, because they think that iron was everywhere. They think like in Egypt, they had some iron that was there. Now, I'm sure in Babylonia, like in Mesopotamia, they may have had some iron at the time, but just I think a lot of it wasn't really used in warfare at that time as much overall. But over time, they'll start figuring out that they can, mine for iron ore and then use that to make a lot of iron weapons. And so they think that's going to help to bring in the Iron Age. They think later. They think the Hittites and other groups kind of helped start that. In Iron Age kind of starts around, they think, the 12th century is about maybe when it gets going at that point. But Hittites are not around long. Hittites, they kind of peak for only a few hundred years, and they end up getting wiped out by these people called they call them the Sea Peoples. I don't know if you've heard about the Sea Peoples, about that particular group. They're kind of a mysterious people that come in. It's around about, by the way, the Hittite Empire peaked when Ramses the Great was like ruling over like the new kingdom of Egypt. In fact, those two actually were the rivals. Like Egypt and the Hittites hated each other. They were like they fought for like control of Syria between Turkey and what is like where Israel, Lebanon is. And I think that they study about the Battle of Kadesh. I'll talk about it later when I get to the Egyptians. But that was like a really famous battle. I think it might say like the first major famous battle in history you hear about, Battle of Kadesh that occurred, which I think was a draw. Like either side could really beat each other at that time. But the Sea Peoples were some kind of confederation of seafaring peoples that they think had iron weapons that kind of attacked the eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea. They came out of the north and they attacked different parts of the eastern Mediterranean. They attacked Turkey. They attacked into like where Lebanon, Israel is. They attacked Egypt also. And they don't really know who they are. There's been all kinds of speculation, about who the Sea Peoples were. It's been a big mystery. Still, people are talking about it today, about the Sea Peoples, but there's been all kinds of theories like they could have been the Philistines that settled in Israel, the Israelites themselves, maybe. Some people think they were the Mycenaeans or the Minoan culture that are like in the Aegean basin around Greece. Some people think they're the later Greeks that come in, the Hellenic peoples that come in, or the Trojans, even. They talk about the Trojans. I think Herodotus even mentioned like it could have been the Phrygians who were from the Balkans that settled in Turkey, like Western Turkey later. So it's kind of like, they're still kind of like still trying to figure out, what happened with that. But what they do think that happened eventually was that because of these invasions by these so-called Sea Peoples, it created the so-called Late Bronze Age collapse. Sometime after 1200 BC, and you have all these different cultures that decline afterwards. Hittites decline in Turkey. The New Kingdom would collapse eventually afterwards as well. Mycenaean culture collapsed, and things like that. And it's replaced by these other cultures that come in, like the Assyrians, etc., that are, more powerful. The Greeks that are more powerful, etc. So that's just kind of all these different theories they have about the Sea Peoples. And like Hattusa, like that capital, Hattusa, the capital of the Hittites, it was actually wiped out by them. The Sea Peoples came in and just burned it down. They were pretty much wiped out at that point. The Phoenicians are like close to like 1200 BC. So it's like close to the same time period. You can even throw them in, Phoenicians maybe even, because the Phoenicians were seafaring. So it could have been them also as well. Yeah. So it's all kinds of groups it could be, you know. I think one thing I remember about the Egyptians remarked that they thought they were, I think it's the ones that they had captured, that they were circumcised. You know, like Semitic people tend to be circumcised, if you know about that, like Arabs, Jews. That may have been, they could have been Semitic type people, possibly, which Phoenicians were, you know. But anyway, so yeah, let me go ahead and continue next. Of course, I want to go ahead and, of course, move on. Also talk about the Assyrian period that comes in. We're going to get into that and talk about the development of Assyria, because that's really the next thing that really happens in history. Is you've got the Assyrians and have like a dark age that kind of occurs because of that late Bronze Age collapse. And Assyria actually emerges out of it to be a powerful in Mesopotamia, northern Iraq, mostly in Syria. And I've got a map showing you the region. I think I've got a couple maps showing the area of Assyria. I've got like, I think this one might be one of the better ones, which is right here. But Assyria is a region that's in northern Iraq, which develops mostly, let's blow this up here for you, but you can see it mostly develops around two major cities they had, Ashur, which is right here, along the Tigris River Basin, and then also Nineveh. Ashur, by the way, was considered like their early capital. That was important. Like you say, they developed around the upper Tigris, is where their people were. They were a Semitic type people. Of course, the Assyrians, they were related back to the Akkadians. And Ashur was the capital of like the old and middle Assyrian empires, or kingdoms that were around. There's later a so-called Neo or New Assyrian Empire, which is based around Nineveh, which was built a little later, I think during the Iron Age. This is more like into the Bronze Age when they started a long time ago. And the Assyrians, by the way, are known for their language. If you know about the Assyrians, they're the ones that helped develop Aramaic and spread it throughout that region of the Middle East. That became their official language. Although they think the actual people that developed Aramaic was the Arameans, which were in Syria. That's where it came from, the language. And people still speak, by the way, Neo-Aramaic or Assyrian-type dialects. They're still spoken today throughout that part of the Middle East. So it's still a extant language, at least the newer versions of it that are basically around. They're known for their religion. That's one thing about the Assyrians. I think I've got pictures showing some of their gods. Like one of their, well, of course, I've got the goddess Ishtar, which is right there. But Ashur was the religious capital of the Assyrian Empire. That's where they had their main temples there. They had two chief gods there. They had Ashur, which is probably the more famous one that's well known. Ashur was a type of Assyrian war god that was real famous. And then Ishtar was a goddess that was mostly a fertility goddess. She was also a goddess of like love and beauty, sex, and I think also war. She was a war goddess as well. Sumerians called her Inanna. There's different images of her. I think that might be one image of Ishtar that was real popular. Babylonians also worshipped a lot of these gods like Ishtar, but other gods were also adopted from previously, like the Babylonians that they had before. That's kind of where the name came from. They think that, I think that the name Ashur, like the city, supposedly means the city of the god Ashur. I think that's what usually the translation, I guess, of the name kind of means. And it's usually pronounced with a sh sound, not ass, but Ashur. That's how they usually say it. I believe I've had people in the Middle East say it's actually Ashurian, how they said it, not Assyrian. I don't know. Were there other major at this time? Yeah, there's a lot of other gods. Of course, we've talked about the Sumerian ones that went back to that time. They had those. We talked about, I think we talked about, was it Ninkasi and a few others that were similar. All the other deities, names, and purposes. Well, I don't know if I've got all of them in there. I know Shamash was another god they kind of borrowed as well. The god of the sun, that was around as well, which is a male god that they had. I don't know if I've got the female gods listed anywhere that I've got, but I could kind of relate those back to you later if you want me to look them up later about them. But Ishtar was the most famous one. Ishtar, they think, influenced the goddess Isis. Like Isis in Egypt, supposedly evolved from that particular god. They think that Aphrodite or Venus, which the Romans call her later, it's kind of like a variation of like a lot of these similar type gods that they had. Naboo was popular too. Naboo, I don't even remember Naboo. Naboo was like the god of wisdom, writing. It's a very popular god later, also by the Babylonians later, like Nebuchadnezzar's time. Nebuchadnezzar is named after Naboo also as well. All right. Let me also talk about a little bit about the Assyrian Empire. It's I want to talk about like the one thing about the Assyrian Empire. It is one of the first major Iron Age empires that you have. You can see there it started in the Bronze Age originally. So it was a Bronze Age culture like from the beginning, based around Ashur. But you get down to the time of Tiglath-Pileser III. He was one of their first great kings in the Iron Age. And you get this so-called period that they refer to it as the so-called Neo-Assyrian Empire, which peaks from about the 10th century to the 7th century BC. So it's an Iron Age Near Eastern empire. By the way, the Assyrian Empire was one of the largest in the world at the time. It's not that big. It's not quite like 1 million like square miles or anything like that, but I think it's 500,000 square miles. Was about the size of the Neo-Assyrian Empire overall. And one thing about them, their militaries were very good. The Assyrian Empire, its professional armies were kind of copied by other people. So Persian Empire, Greeks, Romans that come later, they copy a lot of their innovations in warfare. In fact, a lot of their professional armies were some of the best at siege warfare at the time, and so they were able to conquer a lot of cities throughout that time. So start using like a lot of iron weapons, mailed cavalry. I think chain mail starts to kind of come in at that time that you have. Other things they were known for too, which they're famous for, they use mass conscription. Like other people do this too as well, but people that they would conquer, they would force all the best men into their armies. And other people they'd use as slaves, which they were famous for. So they the first developed siege towers, which they would roll up to cities to knock down walls or breach the walls. They had catapults. They think that Syrians were the ones that were the first to develop battering rams to knock down doors or whatever as well. Also, here's some other stuff too. They had one of the first to have a corps of engineers, which made stuff like weapons and siege towers, built bridges, they built roads. They had armored cavalry. Also, they were the first to use camels, believe it or not, to move like supplies around as a force. Their armies were pretty effective, by the way. They could move about 30 miles a day, which is pretty good for that time. They built the first system of roads, which others like the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, and others, will copy later in building roads, etc. They were also cruel conquerors. Like in the Bible, the Assyrians are kind of villainized a lot. You know about this. And they're infamous for deporting people, like mass deportations of enemy populations. They would take all the best men and women and take them back to Assyria and use them like in their armies. They would use them as slaves and so on. And there was a map showing you earlier of like the deportations, which I want to say started back under Tiglath-Pileser III, one of their first great kings in the 8th century. So they start deporting people back to Assyria right there. And they always talk about the so-called lost tribes of Israel. You've probably heard about them, how Israel, was conquered by the Assyrians in the Bible, and a lot of the peoples were eventually deported. And of course, they were never seen again. And I think up to Josephus' time, Flavius Josephus, they talk about, think up to those 10 tribes that are lost, except for, I think, Benjamin and Judah. There's a majority of the other tribes were all basically kind of assimilated or absorbed into like Assyria. So that's kind of like, some of the background of the Assyrian Empire. It's kind of this state that kind of reigned with an iron fist, more or less, with their militaries. And from there, they began expanding. The empire would keep going, if you know about this. Expansion of the empire, they started in like northern Mesopotamia, like that area of Syria, like around Nineveh and Ashur. From there, they take over the Levant, where Israel is. They take over like the western part of Iran as well. They take over southern Turkey, and then also Syria. And then, of course, I don't have it in that on the bottom there, but they also eventually take over Egypt. So they will conquer Egypt and expand their empire even further. So yeah, that's kind of like the background of the so-called Neo-Assyrian Empire, which peaks around 3 centuries, 10th to about the 7th centuries. Now, I'll kind of talk about some of their famous kings that were well known. I think I've kind of got one here I know, which is Sargon. Sargon II is really considered to be the most famous king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. He reigned in the 8th century BC. He was one of 2 sons of Tiglath-Pileser III, who I kind of mentioned briefly earlier. By the way, Tiglath-Pileser III, I don't think I had anything on him, did I, about that particular ruler, but he was the one that kind of developed their military. And then under Sargon began to expand the empire even more after his father did. And the reason why Sargon's famous is because he's basically this ruler that starts a dynasty of kings that is often called the Sargonid dynasty, which has 7 kings in it. It's like the last 7 kings that they have of the Assyrian Empire. And some of these, by the way, are really famous. Besides Sargon, you've got Sennacherib, you may have heard of, Esarhaddon as well, and Ashurbanipal. All 4 of those, I think at one point, most of them are mentioned in the Bible. No, Sennacherib is for sure, Sargon. And it's a royal dynasty of kings which are around for, you can see, over 100, almost 100-something years overall. Yeah, here's Tiglath-Pileser III, but they think he's the one that is the father of Sargon II. They think he's the one that really introduced a lot of the reforms that created the actual Neo-Assyrian state that we know of later that's so dominant. He also developed a lot of their military. So that's why he's kind of important as king before Sargon II came in. So I think a combination of like, you go back up here, Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, I think Sennacherib, those 3 kings mostly were the main kings that conquered like Israel. It took all those tribes back to Assyria that we talked about. So it's like a combination of several of them that were instrumental in that. Now they got this other king that they always talk about. He's real important. And that's Ashurbanipal. He's really considered to be one of the last of the great kings of the Assyrians. He's a 7th century king. Under him, they think that Assyria and also their capital of Nineveh would peak in size. I think there's an estimate that Nineveh at that time, at least in the 7th century, was one of the largest cities in the world, like probably over 100,000 population, 100 to 150,000, I think was the range. I think the population was. And the city itself was about 4 or 5 square miles, like all the walls and the gates that were kind of around the city today. Not much is left of it today. Like if you look at pictures of, here's a picture of, they think, what it looked like with the Royal Library of Ashurbanipal that was part of that as well. But most of it's ruins. Nineveh is located near the northern Iraqi city of Mosul. And they've actually reconstructed some of the gates that actually went into the city. The city itself was destroyed years ago, back in the early 600s BC. But Ashurbanipal was known for a lot of different things. First of all, at the time, if you study about that, up to his time, Egypt was conquered. So I think his father and I think Ashurbanipal were the ones that conquered Egypt. I know his father conquered it, and his father was Esarhaddon, which I didn't really talk about as much, but actually the Egyptians rebelled, and I think Ashurbanipal had to reconquer it. So they conquered it twice, Egypt. He controlled Iraq, he controlled Syria, he controlled Israel, he controlled Turkey, and part of Iran. So this was a massive empire, at the time that Ashurbanipal had. He was also known for his library. That's something they always talk about that's kind of famous. Ashurbanipal, I think I mentioned about the library originally, but he was known for constructing that during his reign. Ashurbanipal began to collect a lot of different tablets, of information all across Mesopotamia and his empire. And so the Library of Ashurbanipal became one of the first, systematic, organized library in the world. And at one point, they think it may have contained more than 30,000 tablets. And it wasn't really found, by the way, until the 1850s. Austin Henry Layard, who was a British archaeologist, actually discovered the ruins of it. And so from there, they were able to kind of, collect what they could find, like the different tablets that were there. And that particular library, by the way, was very famous for discovering one of the most complete copies of the Epic of Gilgamesh in it. And if you know about the library, they say Alexander the Great may have seen it. It was part of like Ashurbanipal's, great palace that was there. And he may have been influenced to actually build the library of Alexandria in Egypt back in the 4th century BC. So it's interesting about how this guy Ashurbanipal seemed to be kind of like a type of king that was really interested in the arts, literature. He was a patron of the arts and so on, literature. And most Assyrian kings were not. A lot of Assyrian kings were more into war. I think there's even a case where some of the Assyrian kings were not really that literate compared to, say, Ashurbanipal. Now, what happened to the Assyrians? Well, the Assyrian Empire eventually collapsed. It got conquered by other peoples. In fact, you got a new state that comes in that's called the Neo-Babylonian Empire, also called the New Babylonian Empire, which I'll talk a little bit about today. But what happened was they believe in the late part of the 7th century BC, the Neo-Assyrian Empire collapsed due to civil war internally, also externally as well, because they were actually attacked by foreign powers and also powers that were inside of their empire. And Nineveh was actually sacked and destroyed, like in 612 BC, the so-called Battle of Nineveh, they sometimes called it. And what happened was an allied army of Babylonians, which I think were mostly people like the Chaldean peoples, which were in southern Iraq at the time, the Medes, who were in northern Iran, Scythians, who were in also northern Iran. Both those were kind of like Persian-type peoples. They kind of joined forces to attack Assyria, and they destroyed it. So by 609, within like a 3-year period, the Assyrian Empire was wiped out. It was broken up. after that. So what happened afterwards, you get this new state that eventually emerged to take over, which I just told you about. It was called the Neo-Babylonian Empire, or New Babylonian Empire is like a nickname that, historians call it later to have. It was actually called Chaldea, is what they called it, because it was controlled by a people called the Chaldeans, who would rule it as a dynasty. And so they called it that nickname, Neo-Babylonian or New Babylonian, because it was actually an empire that was based around Babylonia and Babylon. And you had not had, an empire that was based in southern Iraq like that anyway, since going back to Hammurabi's dynasty that controlled that region. So you can kind of blow it up here. You can see how this empire stretched from Iraq into part of, you can see almost up into Syria, all the way into Israel. I think at one point briefly they controlled Egypt for a while, but I think they lost it. So it's not around long. It's a short-lived empire. You see 626 to 539. So it lasts roughly 600-700 years or so. That's kind of around. And it's actually considered one of the last major Semitic empires that you have. It actually rules over that region right there. Now, I told you that the people that would control the dynasty that ruled over, like King Nebuchadnezzar later and all that, were related to people called the Chaldeans or Chaldea peoples that were located. They're kind of hard to see on the map, but they think the Chaldean peoples live kind of like in the southern part of Iraq, where Iraq is in Kuwait. So like it's actually below Babylon is where they were. So-called Chaldean peoples. I think they believe that there was a theory that some of the Israelites were related to the Chaldeans or something like that. I don't know if that's really true about that. But let me go ahead and talk about this particular empire that emerges at this point. Now, it had a founder. I don't really have a picture of him, but the founder of the actual empire was not Nebuchadnezzar. It was his father, a king named Naboo-Palasser, they called him. He ruled back in 626 BC. He's the one that started the state itself. And then his son, who took over afterwards, was Nebuchadnezzar II, who came in later. And Nebuchadnezzar is really the greatest ruler that you have of this particular state overall. In fact, he's not just the greatest ruler, he's also the longest reigning that rules at that time. And they actually consider Nebuchadnezzar to be one of the greatest kings in history up to this time, at least in this region of the world. I know in the Bible he's considered one of the most famous kings, as you really read about. He reigns 40-something years between the 7th and 6th centuries. And his name, by the way, Nebuchadnezzar, the name itself comes from the god of wisdom in writing, Naboo, who I told you about, that went back. I think I went back to almost like Babylonian times, went back to Hammurabi and all that, which the Assyrians worship Naboo as well. But he's considered their greatest king. He practically rebuilt Babylon, rebuilt the city, its fortifications, its walls, its gates. He built a lot of the main palace complex that would be there. He also built a lot of ziggurats and other, complexes that were famous there a long time ago. Now, I got images of some of the things that he kind of rebuilt. I know one of the things they talk about Hammurabi that's well known is, of course, he's the one that's famous for building the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, of course, which were supposedly built, you see, on the Euphrates River, East Bank. It's kind of built like a ziggurat, but it's more like a type of palace and garden, really, that was built for his wife. His wife was Amitis. He was from Iran. If you know about the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon was considered one of the so-called 7 wonders of the world, according to the ancient Greeks. Anyway, I think the estimate on that particular palace is it may have been close to, like, I want to say 100 feet tall in existence. I had some other images that I had earlier, but they think that at one point the hang guards of Babylon had some kind of mechanical waterfalls where they brought water to the top and like basically came down and it had like trees, greenery, and a lot of these like kind of like the ziggurats, if you know about them, they were meant to look like a mountain, basically. In fact, it did look like a mountain, pretty much the hanging gardens, and it was around for, like, I want to say 2 centuries or so, up to like the time of, I want to say Alexander the Great, and of course you can see in the background right here, that's the hanging gardens behind me, and Alexander tried to have it rebuilt. They think that, and him, and I think he also tried to rebuild Antimonanke as well, which they think was also built by Nebuchadnezzar, but both of them collapsed, they think, due to earthquakes. But I think in the ancient site of Babylon that's there, it's the ruins that are still there. They're not sure if the bottom of it's still there or not. There's kind of a debate about where it is and all that. There's one thing that's kind of famous he's known for. It's also kind of controversial, if you know much about it. It's the Ishtar Gate. You may have heard about this, but that's something he was known for building. It's really the most famous gate into the ancient city of Babylon. I think it's like one of 8 gates that he built. It honored actually the goddess Ishtar and also the god Marduk as well. And it's got bulls and dragons on it. And anyway, it's a very famous gate that was apparently in the 1900s, 1930s to be exact. German archaeologists actually dismantled it, brought it back to Germany, like Berlin, where it is now. And they put it back together. It's now in the Pergamon Museum. So it's kind of controversial because I think the people of Iraq want it back, along with other things. I guess they want the Hammurabi Code back too in France. So, but anyway, those are things that they supposedly that Nebuchadnezzar constructed in his lifetime. Babylon, by the way, was a massive city. They think at the time it was bigger than Nineveh. I think they estimate that Babylon was maybe about 200,000 people living there. They think at one point 4 square miles or more, I think, in size. And the ruins of Babylon, as you know, they're about, like I said, about 50 miles to the southwest of Baghdad today. And I think I told you recently that in the 1980s that Saddam Hussein, president of Iraq, went through this restoration project where he rebuilt like the palace of Nebuchadnezzar and a bunch of other buildings. That's something that he's kind of known for. I always thought the other bad things he did, but actually those things were kind of good, I guess, historically for I guess modern Iraq overall. So yeah. And there's one more thing that Nebuchadnezzar is kind of known for. I think it's one of those things that's kind of like maybe he's infamous for or whatever. But he's the one, if you know about it, that sacked the kingdom of Judah. As you know, I'll get to it later. Israel split in half. There were 2 states. There were rival Israelite states. Kingdom of Israel in the north, and they had the kingdom of Judah in the south. The Israel state was conquered by the Assyrians. Most of them were wiped out. But Judah survived, and Nebuchadnezzar in the early 6th century conquered it, and he sacked the capital of Jerusalem, including its famous Temple of Solomon, was destroyed. So I'll get to it later, but you have the so-called Babylonian captivity, where most of the people, the Jews, I guess they're called later, or put in captivity in Babylonia, for about 50 years or so. And Nebuchadnezzar is depicted as this villain, in the Bible. He's in numerous different, books in the Bible, in the Old Testament. Book of Daniel, I think the most famous, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Book of Kings, But But he's, like I said, very famous. That's one thing about Nebuchadnezzar at the time. But after Nebuchadnezzar died, the empire really, it didn't do well. Like his sons, grandsons, etc. And later kings, what happened later, after it declined, it got overpowered by this bigger state that was in the east, which of course is Iran, the Persian Empire. That you have the Iranian or Persians, and eventually, they'll come in and take over most of the Near East, from Iran all the way to Iraq, Turkey, and Egypt. Eventually, so I won't, of course, talk about the Persians today. We'll probably have a separate lecture on them. I might not get to them until I get to the Greeks and all that, because Greeks and the Persians end up basically fighting out later of that region. But one more thing about the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Like I said, it's the last major Semitic empire that actually controls that region, like the Near Eastern region, because all your states that fall away, whether empires or whatever there are, that come later, are either Indo-Aryan, like the Persian Empire. They're like the Greeks empires, like the one of, I guess they had the one of Alexander the Great that had, was Indo-European, right? Greek. The Romans, because it's part of the Roman Empire later, like Iraq, Mesopotamia. So you don't really see any Semitic people having any control over that region afterwards. Until now, really, I guess, maybe somewhat. But Iraq today is a mix of peoples. You got peoples that are, based in Iran, like the Kurds and all that in the north that you've got. And you got other people that are Arabic that are also there in the region. So they're kind of a mix of peoples. And you have people that are Christian, not Muslim, too, as well. But they're a minority overall. Right. So I don't know if anybody else had any other questions. I think I know you're asking about the female gods of the Assyrians. And I'll maybe try to add some stuff later about that later, maybe in the comments later. I know Ishtar is the big one I always talk about. So that's no other questions right now that we have. But yeah, Tonica, kind of coming in late. So yeah. But anyway, so that's it for the week, pretty much. Before I go, I want to remind you about a few things. Don't forget pre-test contract policy page. Don't forget those are due Friday. Probably going to start working on the attendance probably today. So hopefully you've kind of gotten that. That should have been done already pretty much earlier, because I had that up there forever pretty much. But don't forget, next week, prehistory quiz is due next Wednesday, and the Mesopotamia quiz will be due next Thursday. So I'll kind of try to send out reminders. I know, like I said, I'm going to be out of town next week, but I am going to have some lectures that are kind of recorded next week, which will be on ancient China. So I'm kind of going out of order here. We'll have a quiz on that. That'll be next week that I'll have. Now, I think I'm going to have also another I'll have like a video type quiz I'll have, which will be on China as well, which will be on the Great Wall of China. So kind of doing that out of order, but week 3, I'll kind of move on and I'll talk about ancient Egypt mostly. So week 3, we'll probably have a exam too. So I know it's going quick, but it is an 8 weeks class in the summer. Hey, yeah, thanks. So it's going to go pretty quick. So try to keep up with the class, get your assignments done. I'll see y'all later. But don't forget, you can send me comments, questions anytime you want, of course, on my YouTube channel. So try to do that, whenever you can. So y'all take care. Have a great weekend coming up, by the way. And I'll see you later. So y'all take care.